Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to try to bring World War I to a close, talking about the factors that brought the United States into the war and how this tipped the balance of this spectacularly disruptive conflict, leading to a victory for the Allied powers. So, apologies, spoiler alert, if you didn't know the Allies were going to win. Let's tell the story and bring this war to a close so we can spend a lot more time talking about and sorting out all the aftermath of the war. So, here we go. One of the factors in this war of attrition was the blockades. So, as we talked about previously, England had set up a blockade of the Germans and had cut off most trade to the Germans. The Germans responded with submarine warfare. The German undersea boat was because they could not fight off the English Royal Navy. Instead, they had to use this sort of countermeasure, these submarines, to shoot down ships going to England. The problem with this is this was often considered a war crime. Submarines at the time were supposed to have to surface and announce themselves before attacking, which made them vulnerable to attack. So instead, the Germans started a campaign of what's called unrestricted submarine warfare, where they simply started sinking ships without warning, which of course led to some significant international pressure. For the Germans, they believed, of course, that this was necessary in a war of attrition. We've read this German Zeppelin pilot's letter to his mother before, but I'll present it here for you again, so pause and read. And in the end, what everyone expected to happen happened. They sank a civilian ship that may have been carrying weapons, and by may have been carrying weapons, we mean absolutely was carrying weapons, called the Lusitania. This was the sister ship to the Titanic. In the end, it had some Americans on board, and this created an international incident. The American government demanded that the Germans stop unrestricted submarine warfare or face war with the United States, and Germany, understanding that if the United States got into the war on the side of the Allies, they were probably doomed, agreed. They kept the United States neutral by stopping submarine warfare. The downside of this, of course, was that this allowed supplies to keep flowing into England and made it much more difficult for the Germans to win their war of attrition. The United States had traditionally been neutral in European conflicts. Woodrow Wilson, the president at the time, ran on a campaign that he kept us out of war in 1916, after being elected on a America First platform in 1912. And so Wilson was committed to keep the United States out of the war. And I'm skirting over the United States role here, of course, because you're eventually going to take an American history course, or you can find some American history videos to fill in all these gaps. So we're trying to focus on a European/global perspective here, with the understanding that there are other resources out there. The problem for the Central Powers, and specifically for Germany, is that when they stopped unrestricted submarine warfare, the United States was still selling crazy amounts of both consumer products and also military supplies to the Allies. And so, although the United States was ostensibly neutral in this conflict, as you can see here, you're seeing massive amounts of exports to European countries, to England, to France, to things like that. And so Germany was trying to outlast not just the manufacturing capacity of the declared Allied powers, but also the manufacturing capacity of this new United States. For the United States, of course, this led to their massive expansion of their economy and the U.S. becoming sort of an economic center of the world. And for Germany, they really had no good choices here. If they stopped U.S. shipments coming into England, it meant war with the United States. But if they allowed it to continue, they had to face the economic might of the United States and somehow outlast them without actually fighting them, which was incredibly challenging for them. So as you lay out here, this is the General Paul von Hindenburg laying out the situation, understanding that they're probably going to have to bring the United States into the war. The United States was brought into the war with the revealing of the Zimmermann Note. Tensions between the United States and Mexico had been relatively high because the Mexican Revolution had led to a Mexican invasion of the United States, with a General Pancho Villa attacking the town of Columbus, New Mexico. The United States had launched a punitive expedition into Mexico, which the Mexicans resented pretty substantially, and tension was high between these two North American neighbors. Germany attempted to capitalize on this tension. They were planning to unleash unrestricted submarine warfare again, with the understanding that the U.S. would come into the war. So they hoped they could convince Mexico to distract the United States for long enough to have Germany win the war And then afterwards, Germany would help Mexico regain some southern territories in the United States that the United States had taken in the Mexican-American War. There was really no chance that Mexico was going to support this, even if the telegraph got to them, which it did not, if it was even real. In the end, it was revealed by British Secret Service and forwarded on to the United States, and this led the United States to declare war on Mexico. To declare war on Germany. We did not declare war on Mexico, although we did occupy the port of Veracruz during in 1917. So Woodrow Wilson's laying out his reasons to declare war on Germany, and now the clock is really on for Germany because they're going to need to knock the Allies out before the United States mobilizes. The United States, shockingly to the world, mobilizes much more quickly than anyone could have anticipated. Woodrow Wilson was a progressive who believed that government organization could solve society's problems, and he took that basic message, that basic worldview, and used it to organize the U.S. government for World War I. The Council on National Defense helped mobilize the American economy, mobilize the American military, created propaganda wings, encouraged women to go into factories, took out huge loans to fight the war. And so the United States mobilized much more effectively than they'd ever mobilized before and prepared to fight much quicker than the Germans anticipated we would be able to. During this time period, the Germans launched the massive Kaiser Battle, or Kaiserschlacht, which was a series of 5 different offenses, the first of which was the St. Michael offense. The Germans were taking all of their troops that had been moved off the Russian front lines. As we talked about last time, Russia had signed a different peace treaty, an armistice with Germany called Brest-Litovsk. And so we have all of these German troops freed up to move over and launch their final counterpunches against the Allies to attempt to exhaust them before the Americans arrive. You can see huge numbers of German troops overwhelming these lines. The Germans are also using increasingly advanced techniques, including things like a creeping barrage, by which soldiers who are advancing are protected by artillery fire, which slowly moves forward in order to provide a shield for them, eventually allowing them to get right up into the trenches. They're also beginning to use infiltration tactics, which are going to become an important part of the Second World War, in which small groups of soldiers act independently to take key objectives. But in the end, it was not soon enough. At the Second Battle of the Marne, right outside Paris, Allied troops, bolstered by American reinforcements, stopped the German offensive and basically guarantee that this German offensive is not going to break through. Once the Germans are stopped at the Marne, the Allies begin a counter-push to retake the territory that was captured under the St. Michael offensive. This Ardennes offensive or Spring offensive or 100 Days offensive pushes the Allies or pushes the Germans back and more or less guarantees that the war is going to be won by the Allies and Germany is going to lose. The Hindenburg Line was the line of German defenses that they had established after the stalemate had sort of settled in. The Allies were able to break this line at the Second Battle of the Somme by introducing a new technology, the tank. These tanks at the time operated more like really heavily armored personnel carriers that could crush barbed wire and drive over trenches. And so this allowed Allied troops to break through German defenses and to start rendering trench warfare possibly obsolete by the end of the war. Tanks are going to, of course, play a huge role in the Second World War, and so when we get there, we'll talk more about them. But for now, no, Second Battle of the Somme, tanks were unleashed, and they helped break through the Hindenburg Line, leading to the collapse of Germany. The war ended on November 11th at 11 a.m., and on 1918, peace was declared, and now we have to have a massive peace treaty to try to figure out sort of what's going to happen in the aftermath of all of this. So I'm going to go through the Treaty of Versailles probably too quickly because, again, there's only so much depth you need to go into in this class. So here's the treaty. Here's my 5-minute summary of the Treaty of Versailles. The Treaty of Versailles was negotiated mostly by the Allies, and specifically the Big Three. The Big Three were Lloyd George was the Prime Minister of Great Britain, David Lloyd George. George Clemenceau was the Prime Minister of France, and Woodrow Wilson was President of the United States. Vittorio Orlando was the Prime Minister of Italy, and sometimes I've heard this described as the Big Four, but considering how much Italy was boxed out of the final treaty negotiations, I think describing them as the Big Three is probably more useful for students of history. Clemenceau was known as the Tiger. He had fought in the Franco-Prussian Wars. He was pretty angry at Germany over starting this whole war. And in the aftermath, now that he had Germany at its mercy, he really wanted to inflict similar punishment to Germany that the Prussians inflicted upon the French after the Franco-Prussian War. And so Clemenceau was big on revenge for Germany. Here's his basic position here. Take a moment, read, and we'll move on. David Lloyd George needed to both appease a British public who wanted Germany punished, but also understood that punishing Germany too harshly might sow the seeds of future wars. And he had to some degree, keep Clemenceau happy. And so he's going to, for the most part, take sort of a middle path here. Not as sour as Clemenceau, but not as sweet as Woodrow Wilson. And so he's going to some degree, again, take a middle path. Woodrow Wilson is going to push a very idealistic plan for peace called the 14 Points. These 14 points attempted to more fairly solve the problems of World War I, more fairly divide up colonies, and push this idea of national self-determination and a League of Nations, a place in which European and countries around the world can discuss their problems as opposed to fighting. Woodrow Wilson had been trying to convince the Europeans to support his 14 points, going all the way back to 1915. So when he showed up at the Versailles Peace Treaty with the 14 points, he really expected to be able to convince Europeans to get on board, which it turns out they were really, really, really not interested in. Here's Wilson's 14 points. Here we see political cartoons showing Woodrow Wilson trying to lecture the Allies about trying to, create a better future world. You can see here the 14 points, relative, at least the first 5, relatively idealistic and attempting to solve the problems that led to the First World War. And in the end, the Treaty of Versailles did not at all mirror the 14 points. There was the creation of a League of Nations. Some of the territorial changes Wilson wanted were put in there, but instead, Germany was blamed for the war. They had to lose all their colonies, pay huge amounts of reparations, things like that. And so the 14 points were not the framework for peace, and instead the Treaty of Versailles, at least in this political cartoonist mind, are sowing the seeds of future conflicts and really solving none of these problems. In the Middle East, the secret Sykes-Picot Agreement was revealed by the Russians after the revolution. This was a secret plan to partition the Ottoman Empire, and despite the fact that the Allies in the aftermath said that they would push national self-determination, when we get to nationalism in the Middle East, what we're going to see is these spheres of influence are absolutely going to happen. British and French mandates are going to be a thing, and we're going to do this whole Palestine thing, which is going to be a hot mess and cause problems later. But I don't want to muddy the waters by getting into this. Germany's going to lose all their colonies, but no one else is going to be willing to give up theirs. And there's going to be a massive scramble for Germany's colonies, which is going to lead to future conflict. And all the war guilt clauses are going to lead to problems for Germany. Germany's going to have to accept all the blame for the war as the only central power that's left. As you can see, the Austro-Hungarian Empire is going to be partitioned up. The Ottoman Empire partitioned up. We'll tell that story later. And Russia, of course, also gone, creating this whole Soviet Union thing, which we're going to spend more time on later. The League of Nations was created, but Woodrow Wilson was unable to convince the isolationists in the United States to get on board with it, and so the United States did not join the League of Nations, which is going to be a huge problem going forward for the United States. We're also going to see a number of countries who leave the League of Nations, which becomes problematic for a global peacekeeping force if a bunch of nations leave it. So the League of Nations was a decent idea, but we're going to talk about why it was not super effective as we move forward. The war guilt piece is really problematic for Germany. Having to accept the blame for the war and pay infinity dollars in reparations is going to utterly crush the German spirit, crush the German economy, and lead to this belief amongst German soldiers that they have been sold out by their leaders. This stabbed in the back theory is going to become central to German political thought going forward and is really going to pave the way for a lot of extremist groups to get in to power. The unlimited, again, the massive indemnity is going to prevent the German economy from functioning, is going to create massive hardship in Germany, and the Germans are going to feel threatened by the fact that they can't have an army to defend themselves against potential threats around them. And so this is going to become an important part of the German psyche going forward. Here's German General Erich Ludendorff laying out his views on the treaty. So take a moment, pause, and read. And that's what we have for today. So, Treaty of Versailles, not a great plan for world peace. For the rest of this unit, we're going to be going around the world and sort of unpacking the effects of World War I, going through Asia to the United States, to Africa, to India, to places like that, to the Soviet Union, and talking about how the Treaty of Versailles, and specifically the aftermath of World War I, really reshaped the globe in some pretty profound ways, and then, of course, paved the war for the next cataclysmic conflict, which we'll be getting to next unit. Thank you for listening.